Hey everyone, apologies for the slow post this week. I am catching up on my sick day from Monday, but I want to take a quick look at our Module 4 assignment. I haven't finished grading, I'll do that later today. So far what I've been seeing has been great, so this is going to be pretty quick because you guys are catching on pretty quick. We'll have a little bit more discussion, especially about the last two questions. So, starting with question 1, how did Malthus affect Darwin? Basically, what Malthus was doing, what he was adding, and this wasn't the first time that this had been added to, scientists' theories, but basically Malthus was looking at feedback loops. Positive feedback loops are the sort of things where you add more and it builds up. So compound interest is something with a positive feedback loop. You put money in, you end up with more money, and then that more money grows and you get even more money. It snowballs. And then a negative feedback loop is where you get more of something and then you get some offsetting force. So Malthus's idea of you have this positive feedback loop in population, more people breeding means more babies, means the population grows at a geometric rate. Essentially what Malthus was seeing is what we could call the hockey stick curve. He was looking at the world, and right around here is sort of where Malthus was writing in terms of the Industrial Revolution and humanity's capacity for producing, right? Producing stuff, but also producing food. But basically he was seeing this start of this positive feedback loop where things start to grow geometrically. They start multiplying rather than linearly where they are adding, right? So you look at this straight line over here. Can you see that? Kind of see that. Let's zoom in on that. All right, so this is a linear curve. This is a curve where maybe it looks like it's a linear curve, and then it looks like it's just going out into space, right? So Malthus bringing in these notions of feedback loops, he didn't quite have it down, but these feedback loops were sort of behind the scenes for Darwin as well. Right? For evolution, it's this feedback loop between the success or failure of individuals and how it changes the population. So you could think about, say, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos. Their beak changes in a little way, and over generations that accumulates. But basically, you've got this change that affects a bird's likelihood of survival and reproduction. And over time, those little impacts change what it means to be a finch at all, to the point that you end up with an entirely different species of finch on a different island. Something I think is a very valuable educational experience we don't have time to fit in this class is Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. Fantastic book, really insightful, really helps you to think more clearly about evolution. I would definitely recommend over the summer you borrow this book from the library or you buy it on whatever website you like. It's an excellent book, really refines your ability to think about evolution. And since evolution is everywhere, if you want to succeed in the world we live in, you need to have some understanding of how it works. So definitely look into that. So, long story short, how did Malthus influence Darwin? Basically, he sort of put this idea into Darwin's head, not intentionally. He didn't know Darwin was going to read it, but Darwin, in reading Malthus's essay, gets this idea of we need to think about this struggle, right? There's this negative feedback loop where certain traits, if you have, well, I guess there's a positive and a negative. It's positive feedback loop if your traits drift towards things that better match the environment, and a negative feedback loop if they don't fit the environment. So if you have, you're a finch and your beak doesn't match the types of seeds on the island you live on, you're less likely to pass on those genes, and as a result, in the future, we're less likely to see those traits, and we see a change in the species overall. So, whatever we might say about Malthus, evolution is the most important theory that we've created as a species. So even if Malthus was entirely wrong in everything, we owe him a huge debt for influencing the notion of evolution, or at least helping us to get to that idea sooner, to discover the concept. All right, let's talk about the graph. So we talked about an S-curve. This is the graph I was looking for, some variation of this. But let me also take this time to kind of go with an aside. So on this graph, we've got a linear curve. So this is what Malthus thought our ability to grow food looked like, right? We get more productive over time, but we're not getting multiplicative increases in productivity, right? We're adding more productivity. We aren't multiplying more productivity in Malthus's mind. Now, of course, we know in the last 100 and something years that actually it's very, very different, or I guess almost 200 years now, more than 200 years. In fact, the growth in productivity of food looks more like this red line, which is what Malthus thought the growth in population would look like. So let's stick with just Malthus's idea. Malthus sees this idea of as we get more people, we're going to go expand where we're farming, but we're going to be expanding into less fertile soil, right? So if you think about, say, the difference between, I know you guys haven't dug up dirt in these different places, but if you go to Iowa, especially if you go to Iowa in Malthus's time, it was just like 20 feet of solid, beautiful soil, incredibly, incredibly fertile. You go to somewhere like Massachusetts and it's all rocky. Trying to grow food on a large scale in Massachusetts is not a smart idea if you could instead grow the food in Iowa. So as our population grows, we're going to have to, we're going to use up all the good farmland, right? All the spots in Iowa are going to get used up, and eventually we're going to get to a point where we have to start bringing in that less productive rocky soil in Massachusetts to add to the food. Whatever's going on, we're just not going to be adding at an increasing rate, right? We might even expect it might kind of flatten off. But more importantly, what Malthus was seeing was this geometric curve, which I'm showing here with x to the power of 2.5. It's something that's increasing at an increasing rate. It's growing faster and faster. And at some point, when it outstrips the food supply, you've got an unsustainable position. So what we might expect is we get to here, we have a famine, and then our population drops from this level to somewhere below our food capacity. And then it might start going again. But Malthus is basically expecting this sort of back and forth where we have too many people and then we have some sort of a crash. And then we keep pushing up towards that line and we keep getting pushed back by nature. Now, we mentioned the hockey stick graph. Very often we mistake what is actually an S-curve, right? So there are different sorts of shapes of graphs that we'll see. Out in reality, sometimes we have a positive feedback loop that creates, a hockey stick curve. So you look at something like, I forget the word, but when all the nitrogen gets dumped into the Great South Bay, the algae blooms, right? Algae blooms, you get this explosion in population, and it looks like, okay, there's not much, and then suddenly, hey, there's a huge amount of growth in the population of algae in the water, but at some point, you hit the carrying capacity. There's only so much you can do. You guys have probably heard a lot of these stories about these sort of little fables about positive feedback loops, like the story of the peasant who does something for the king and he says, here's what I want my reward to be. I want 1 grain of rice for the first square on a chessboard, and then 2 on the second, and then twice as much, and then twice as much. And what that boiled down to was you end up with 2 to the power of 64, and he's asking for a bajillion grains of rice. So it sounds like not too bad, because when you say, let's look at the first square, there's not much. You get 1 grain of rice. You go to the second square, you get not much grains of rice. But as you go further, it explodes, right? It gets really enormous. What's the other one? The other story you'll often hear is about what happens with the reproduction rate of bacteria, right? So bacteria does this geometric thing also, where it grows at an increasing rate, but only if you've got enough food for it. So in your biology classes or your science classes in high school, you probably heard a story about, okay, if we let this bacteria double every 30 minutes for a week and a half, there will be enough bacteria to envelop the entire world. But of course, it never actually happens like that. What actually happens is it levels off, right? So what looks like this hockey stick curve very often turns into an S curve. There are many, many patterns like that. You want to get in on this part. That's where you make money, is where something's really growing, but things level out, right? We have finite capacity, and given that, inevitably, what looks like a hockey stick usually turns into an S curve. For population, we certainly see that. I bet Our World in Data has a nice graph here. Population growth, world population growth. So hey, there is definitely a crazy hockey stick curve right there. Let's look at future population growth. So as we get the capacity to keep more people alive, the population explodes, which we've seen over the last couple thousand years, basically. But inevitably, it's going to level out. Let's find, where's our forecast? So here is population growth, right? So we expect the population growth to just start to tank, right? And eventually even go negative. What the UN expects is something like this. So we might, constant fertility would be the hockey stick growth. But basically what demographers expect is over the next 100 years for us to probably level out somewhere around 11 billion people. And at that point, if economic growth is continuing to happen, people get richer and rich people have fewer babies, and so population levels out. What looks like it would be a really scary hockey stick curve. We zoom in on the last few hundred years and we say this looks unsustainable, but the truth is more likely that we hit a peak and we level off, and we might even shrink. So the curve, this is what I was looking for, the graph, right? Linear food production, geometric population increase. Now, a little bit more optimistic. Hans Rosling was a very, very charismatic speaker. All his videos are worth seeing. He was a very talented demographer also. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's one of my favorites. But what Hans Rosling has in mind in this video is, what he's really kind of driving at is that more brains means more brain power, basically. You could think about adding people. I think Buchholz used this metaphor of, when you add people, you're adding hands and mouths and brains. Mouths to feed, hands to work, brains to think. If you're mostly just adding hungry mouths, then more population is really scary. But if you're adding brains, population growth is an opportunity, right? 2 heads are better than 1, 2 billion heads are better than 1. So all else equal, right? This is a very Smithian story. We have more people, we have more capacity for division of labor, we have more ability to solve the problems, like the problem of how do we get enough food. And obviously, living in America, we're at a point where we've gotten the reverse problem. We have too much food. So how does this relate? I mean, there's a lot of connections that we could draw. I think Rosling is certainly not super optimistic. He's not over optimistic. He's not Pollyanna-ish. He recognizes there's a positive aspect to more population and there's a negative, right? There is environmental impact. I think he makes an important point, right? So to people like you, college-educated, smart people, it's really tempting to say, ooh, I'm a smart person. I know all kinds of stuff. I can just control things. I'll impose my value judgments from the top down. Now, hopefully you remember from your principles classes the distinction between normative and positive, and how economists try to stick with positive analysis. We'll definitely see when we talk about John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx that the normative is very much there. But basically, the point I'm getting at is it's tempting to look at this from the top down and think, I can control things. Rosling gives us this point of, if you're a rich person, it's not really up to you to tell a poor person, stop doing this thing that's bad for the environment, right? Let them get rich first. We can judge each other, we can judge ourselves, but judging someone who's struggling to get by with technology that's 200 years out of date for where we live is not fair, right? That's a normative claim, but I think it's a pretty easy claim to stand by. So basically, Rosling is seeing this creative power. He's seeing that we have to be conscious and conscientious, and we have to think about how do we get greener energy, for example, in order to get people over the wash line and over the airline. But he's not seeing this in sort of the dire Malthusian way of all these new people are a threat. They're more of an opportunity, right? And especially when we can do things like provide them with washing machines that frees up their time. Now, little digression on there. I saw one of the few that I've graded so far. One response, kind of talking about how we have this issue of if population keeps growing, we got to keep clearing out natural space to make space for them. I think it's worth reminding. Maybe it's not a reminder. Maybe you haven't come across this notion, but it's worth bringing up the point that cities are incredibly green, right? They're surrounded by concrete and a lack of nature, but people living in a city are able to do so while using far fewer resources than those of us living in the suburbs or people living out in the country. Basically, if you have to drive to work, you are having a big negative impact on the environment. Probably not even just from your car, probably from the roads that someone had to pave for your cars. You compare, I'm here in Patchogue. I have a property with about 1/5 of an acre. If this amount of space was in Brooklyn or Boston or any dense city, instead of being one single detached house with 2 adults living in it, you'd have like 3 or 4 or 5 houses, buildings, not even houses, apartment buildings, and those buildings might have 3 or 4 or 6 units. You would have dozens of people living in the same amount of space. And the roads to service that are going to be even less, right? You don't need as many roads in the city. The infrastructure is going to be bigger and more robust, but you're going to have maybe infrastructure that's twice as big but handles 4 times as many people. So cities, incredibly, incredibly green, and what we really want, if we want to have more capacity for more people, more brains to solve our problems, we want more people in cities. As usual, right, when there's an inefficient thing like this, suburbs are incredibly inefficient. This is happening because weird politics, basically. And we'll talk about that in Module 12 with public choice theory. But essentially what's going on is those people living in the city are very productive and they use relatively few resources. And we all collectively just tax them, right? We take money from their increased productivity and use it to pay for my roads out here in Suffolk County. It's not fair, it's not good, it's not right, but it's what it is. There's also the point on the washing machine, right? A washing machine, we're often tempted to think of this as, oh, this is a machine, it's using energy. It would be much nicer for the environment if I just hand washed my laundry. Now let's put aside the issue of time, right? I think Rosling makes a very compelling argument that it is unfair to expect, a woman in a developing country to have to do a whole bunch of laundry when we could just give her a washing machine instead. So the time aspect, obviously very important, but even the other resources, the washing machine almost certainly uses less soap and water than I would use if I had to wash by hand. Dishwashers are another example. Dishwashers are much more water efficient than hand washing things. You got to pay up front, you got to use resources to make the machine, but over time the machine is saving you resources. So a lot of things that sort of common culture tells us are not environmentally friendly, very often it's sort of counterintuitively the other way around. Cities are very environmentally friendly. Washing machines and dishwashers are surprisingly environmentally friendly. Economic growth, although there is certainly some back and forth and some conflict and things that go wrong and are environmentally destructive, the overall process is pushing in the right direction. We in the first world are usually having a smaller impact on the environment than someone in, say, South Sudan who has to burn wood and animal dung for their energy. We are able to benefit from a lot of economies that reduce our resource use while giving us more stuff. So, how does Rosling relate to Malthus? He's kind of what we get from 200 years of more learning since Malthus's time. More optimistic, more recognizing of the creative power of humanity. Now, of course, we should also point out the creative power of humanity has been misused plenty of times. We created nuclear bombs, right? Humans can do pretty messed up stuff. But overall, if we've got things pushing in the right way, and hopefully we get this from our learning on institutions, if we set the rules right, we get people doing more productive stuff and less destructive stuff. And certainly we see that in things like washing machines, right? Washing machines are an invention for a society that values the capacity of women to have more time, right? For mothers to spend more time doing more important things than just cleaning up after their kids. It's a productive, creative thing, unlike, say, a nuclear bomb, which is creative but destructive. It takes creativity to make, and then it uncreates lots of stuff. All right, so let's think about the prospect of overpopulation. Is it possible that Malthus might turn out to be wrong? What can we do about it? Why was he wrong? And is that source of wrongness always going to be there? So there's certainly a lot of things we could talk about there. I think the big thing that Malthus missed out on is humanity's capacity to adapt and innovate. So he overlooked the fact, because he hadn't really seen it. He was looking at relatively old data. He was looking at the start of that hockey stick graph. He was seeing this linear trend before, not seeing how it was about to explode. He was seeing this potential explosion in population, but he wasn't seeing how that was going to level off and turn into an S-curve. But long story short, he was not anticipating changes in behavior. He was extrapolating from the past into the future without thinking about how people would change what they do in the future. So a big thing that Buchholz mentions is our capacity to add technology, like better breeding programs for wheat, so that we can get more out of a given acre of land. Right? 100 and something years later, when Ehrlich and Simon, they both Paul? I forget. Simon and Ehrlich. Let's look that up. Simon, Ehrlich, wager. Actually, this has a Wikipedia page too. Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon. Okay, Julian Simon was the one betting that commodity prices would fall. He is an economist, and he's recognizing this capacity. Ehrlich, Paul Ehrlich, was a biologist, and he's probably used to thinking of animals who do adapt, but they adapt much more slowly, right? Animals adapt based on genetic evolution, and genetic evolution takes time. By the way, thinking back to the issue of climate change, a big thing there is that our productive capacity is often tied to things that we don't think about, such as pollinators, right? Little bugs. And these little bugs cannot adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. Really interesting thing in that light is, what's his name? I've got it here. Doug Tallamy. Very interesting ecologist who writes about using native plantings in your suburban gardens to try and support local ecosystems. Very interesting work. Definitely another set of books to read over the summer. Less directly applicable to you guys as econ majors, but certainly applicable to understanding evolution a little bit better. So, let me come back to my notes. Was Malthus wrong? Things he missed. One is capacity to adapt and innovate. Humans, we are able to adapt the way we do things with cultural evolution. So cultural evolution is much faster than biological evolution. We're still using Paleolithic brains. We are still built for handling life on the Serengeti, chasing down gazelle. But because we are also using things like businesses and culture and habits and all these things that we have on top of just our biology, these things are able to adapt much, much faster because we don't have to wait for the random mutations that work that are necessary for biological evolution. Now, we can kind of kickstart biological evolution for something like wheat. We can even do genetically modified organisms. It's not easy, right? It's not easy to do the modifications. It's not easy to breed different plants or different animals. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and then putting them into an ecosystem, you're adding in that extra layer of complexity. When complex adaptive systems interact, unexpected things can happen. But long story short, right, missing that capacity is big. I think we could also read Malthus as kind of underappreciating the sophistication of common people. Right? At his time, basically, there was the elite who went to Oxford and Cambridge, and then there was the unwashed masses. Right? People weren't getting high school degrees. People weren't going to college unless they were incredibly rich. So if you just look at the peasants around you at the time, you might think, oh, these are not sophisticated people. But as the Industrial Revolution continued, it really changed the environment that common people were acting in, and with a different set of incentives, we got different behavior. I think that Malthus was basically seeing people as not adapting as quickly as they might. Now, I think economics since then has maybe gone a little too far in the other direction. So neoclassical economists in the mid-20th century, the time that Milton Friedman is writing, Paul Samuelson, who we're not going to talk about a ton here, even going into rational expectations, we kind of expect people to be, actually we'll talk about this a little bit with Veblen in Institutional Economics. Veblen used this phrase of economists seeing people as lightning calculators. Right? We kind of over attribute intelligence to common people with modern mathematical economic models. So hopefully we get some more refinement later on in the semester. But I think Malthus was kind of understating people's capacity to change what they're doing. And then, of course, as Buchholz mentioned, Malthus was also looking at old data, right? So if he had better data, if he had better ability to interpret that data, if he was living in a world where it was relatively easy to just go onto YouTube and watch a class on statistics, his analysis probably would have been better, right? But he was doing it a long time before a lot of the tools of modern statistics had even been invented, so he was at a disadvantage. So, could we go into a world of overpopulation? Should we maybe be worried? Well, we should always be a little worried, right? We should always anticipate some potential problem in the future. For us, I think the biggest, most obvious obstacle humanity's facing, and I'm sure I'm going to see this as I continue grading your work, is climate change. But, and Buchholz brings this up also in the book, there is an important point, which is it's not just uniformly bad. Rising global temperatures is going to be really bad if you live near the Sahara Desert. It's going to be really bad if you live in Bangladesh. It's basically going to be really bad if you live in a poor tropical country. But it's probably going to be good for farmers in Canada, right? In places that are relatively cold, they're going to get an extended growing season. They're going to have the ability to grow even more food. They're going to have less energy going into things like heating homes. Now, on the other hand, we're going to have more energy going into cooling homes in warmer places. Like I said, it's a mixed bag. But one thing we can do, one way we can adapt to higher temperatures is by just moving people to colder places. Politics gets weird here, but really there's an easy solution, which is people in poor tropical countries are going to be at a big disadvantage, but if we move them to rich temperate countries, first off, they're going to be more productive. We're going to get more gains from trade. It's going to be a mutually beneficial thing. We're also going to get younger immigrants coming in to sustain things like Social Security. But an important lesson, a thing my dissertation advisor brought up when I was in school was, we don't care about Haiti, we care about Haitians. We don't care about Bangladesh, we care about Bangladeshis. It's not the land or the country, and certainly not the government that matters, it's the people in that country that matter. If we can move them out of harm's way, all the better. And it's a win-win, right? That's sort of the easy thing, right? If there's ever a dollar bill left on the sidewalk in terms of public policy for 2023, that $1 trillion bill is liberalizing the movement of people across borders. We might worry about, say, the brain drain. So Bangladesh might have all their smart people leave, and that's something to be concerned with. But again, right, if we got all the Bangladeshi people, it's not really a brain drain. It's just changing where the brains are. In our country, we do have kind of a problem like this of rural places. The smart people leave and they go to the city because that's where the opportunity is. And the people left behind have that much less support because they aren't able to benefit from having smart people around. And then we get the weird stuff we see in American politics. So a brain drain is something we should be worried about, right? It affects local areas, but at the same time, it's not the area that matters, it's the people. So if we have a brain drain, we should think more about how do we deal with that rather than how do we prevent that, right? We want smart people to move into the city, to be productive, to come up with innovations that help us to be better able to sustain a population. There are costs to that, and we want to think about how do we address those costs. But still, we basically want to tap into the creative power of people. There's also a concern people have that immigrants might come in and bring bad ideas with them. But we should also be worried about people who are non-immigrants bringing bad ideas with them. In American politics, we have no shortage of bad ideas. Sometimes it comes from young people, sometimes it comes from old people, sometimes it comes from people who moved from somewhere else. The problem is people, right? The problem is not that Californians move to Texas and mess up Texas's politics, or that French people move to America and mess up America's politics. It's that institutions are hard, right? And people bring all kinds of ideas, and we need a process where the good ideas are able to float to the top, right? But that's a problem with or without immigration. All right, so let me look at the question more directly. Are we likely to face overpopulation? Well, I think that we are going to be able to feed up to 15 billion people pretty easily, and I don't think we're going to see the Earth's population exceed that. Is it possible that something changes? Well, we could have global climate change impact our ability to grow. I was mentioning Doug Tallamy earlier. One thing he talks about is how things like some species of beetle can only digest certain plants. So if you get rid of those plants, that beetle goes away. Moths, this is a big deal, right? So caterpillars are often specialized in only a few different species, and if you take those species away, they go away, and you lose some pollinators, and when you lose pollinators, you end up with a different problem. There's a story, I think it was on Planet Money a few years ago, about this valley in China where they killed all the bees. I think they killed the birds and then the bees followed or something, right? There was some horrible ecological disaster, and the result was they had to hire human beings with paintbrushes to go pollinate all the apple trees in the valley. Now, it turned out they were better pollinators. They had a higher percentage of flowers that got pollinated because bees don't care about the pollination. They're just looking for the easy nectar. But long story short, losing the bees meant you had this extra cost. Instead of having people going off solving other problems, they're solving a problem that would have been solved at a much lower cost by having bees. Global climate change could affect our ecosystems in these ways that you and I as economists aren't experts in and can't really even notice, but they're still there, right? The world is incredibly detailed, and these details often matter. And an example of that is pollinators. So with global climate change, we might have something where we throw off our ecosystems, and it turns out that we are getting important services from those ecosystems, and when they disappear, we have to replace them with something else, and that something else is probably going to cost more. So it is possible, right, that we are going to face, or it's maybe even likely that we are going to face difficulties. Will these difficulties be so much that we see a big drop in population? I suspect not. Will they lead to greater negative impacts on the environment? It's possible, right? It kind of depends on where these changes are happening. These changes are happening in a wealthy country like ours or Northern Europe. Voters in those places want national parks. They want to protect the environment, and so there's going to be more, motivation to do so. If these changes are made in somewhere like South Sudan, the people in South Sudan have much more urgent problems than protecting national parks. If you are hungry, your first priority is to get food, not to protect the environment. So, to the extent we have more people who are more wealthy, I think we're in a better position to respond in a way that is responsible and that gets us sort of the most good stuff. So, how do we ensure that Malthus stays wrong? How do we ensure that we don't run into this problem? Well, so the food problem is relatively straightforward. We just keep having motivation to grow food. And this is, a nice standard easy economics thing. When there's profit to be had by feeding people, people will feed people. If it gets harder to feed people, prices go up, but as long as prices are able to go up, we're just getting a stronger incentive for people to look harder to find better ways to get this food. So I think markets give us an incredible amount of power for preventing Malthus's predictions from being wrong. From coming true. There is this other thing that comes up, and Buchholz kind of brings this up with modern environmentalists, and there's a group of people who are anti-growth, who I think kind of get things wrong. I think what they are getting wrong specifically is that they are confusing the physical with the valuable. And this is an easy economic superstition. We tend to think of things as you get something physical, that is real productivity. You get something intangible, it seems like, well, it's not really something new, right? It's just ones and zeros on a server or whatever. But we really do value those things, right? I pay for a subscription to Spotify because I get real value out of that. Even though the engineers at Spotify aren't making me stuff, they are providing value to me. Economic growth in the coming 100, 200 years is going to be a lot less about physical stuff like it was 100 or 200 years ago, and a lot more about digital stuff, for example, and leisure, and intangible things. Recognizing the value in intangible things gives us an out, right? It's not that we haven't had a linear economy where stuff goes from natural resource to the dump, and we want to have this circular economy where we recycle stuff. Yeah, of course we want to recycle stuff, but recycling stuff uses resources also. But we have a situation where people have incentive to respond to changes. The issue is going to be, and really the thing we need to get most correct, is making sure that we don't give people incentive to keep just dumping stuff in the ocean. Right? We want to make sure we get property rights correct in a way, and again, institutions we'll talk about. We want to get property rights right in a way that gives people incentive to do the right thing. When we tax pollution or we make it costly to throw stuff in the dump, that's going to encourage people to do less physical stuff and more intangible stuff. And as long as we're providing value to people and people are getting fed, as an economist, I'm good with that. All right, there's a lot of interesting ideas to explore here. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the discussions, but I am going to get back to grading now. I'll talk to you all in the future.